we can't go past this one, Jake. We've left it until the end, and just in case it goes on for a bit, I'm happy to explore. I'm happy to dig deep with this one. Now, obviously, the big things that have happened this week in the US, the fact that it basically nearly imploded on itself. Wasn't fun to watch. Wasn't fun for anyone to watch. It was a little bit freaky there for a bit. Apparently, it's sort of calmed down a little bit now, which is good. The point here is that it seeped over to us, and luckily for us, it's seeped over in the form of a conversation, and it's been such an interesting journey to take, watching all the news and listening to all the commentators this week, watching to it all sort of unfold, because the focus was just on America. Then it became about, what's happening over here. And then it became about, well, actually a lot is really happening over here. And we need to really have that discussion and sort of tidy up. I guess one way to look at it is to say tidy up our own backyard. If we're going to have this discussion, let's not talk about America too much. Let's talk about some of the injustices and some of the cruel-natured things that are happening here in Australia.
I think it's a really good way to preface it. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know what's happening, Jake. You keep agreeing with this. Good points. Maybe it was the chicken burger. And
definitely was, by the way.
Yeah. Well, it has been. I mean, that's the journey I've been on this week. It's been about sort of going, oh my goodness, America's gone. Gone. We may as well wipe that out.
Yeah,
that was a joke. But to sort of and now we've got some interesting developments over here. I think that if you haven't learnt anything this week, then you haven't been watching the news. If you haven't formed an opinion about something this week, then you really haven't been part of the discussion. I think the fact that it's such a huge discussion, and one that is just bound to rile up emotions on both sides of the argument, and probably people who are in the middle have some sense of emotion about it. I think it's so important that we maintain that conversation, and that if you need to protest, you go out there and protest. So tell us what's happening here, and what's happening over the next few days in regards to these protests.
Yeah, well, I suppose, Greg, you and I had a discussion before the show, and it was, I'm going to try my absolute darndest to stay in Australia, because I've got, all sorts of opinions about America, the way that they've handled it, and the fact that this is just another occasion. But yes, protests are being held all over the country this weekend in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. The protests are in response to the alleged murder of African-American George Floyd by the police officer in the US, and Australia absolutely has had several cases of deaths in custody of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Just clarify that, because I think some people might be a bit alarmed that we said several. So what are the figures there? Because I know you've got some statistics on the go.
Yeah, so, I'll start off with one gentleman. So the family of the 26-year-old David Dungay, a Dunghuti man who said, quote, "I can't breathe," 12 times before he died while being restrained by 5 prison guards, said that they had been traumatized anew by the footage of Floyd's death. Now, Dungay is one of at least 432 Aboriginal deaths in custody since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody that was held in 1991, which is pretty massive.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge. And this is what I mean. If you haven't learned something this week, I mean, you just haven't been paying attention, really.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, keep going with those facts. Yep.
So, well,
is that, yep. The 432. So we're talking about that. Yeah. And so you've got these discussions are heating up here in Australia, and it's been it's just been fascinating to watch it unfold. I think that we do have to be careful. I think that I don't think he's been named. I tried to look up his name. The young 16-year-old boy who was had his legs pulled out from underneath him by the police officer. Yeah. The footage
landed
of that
on his face. Yeah. It was just harrowing.
The whole situation is just dreadful.
It is, and I suppose the thing that aggravates a lot of people is how many commentators will often jump to, what is it that, surely this guy has done something to deserve it, right? What has he done to deserve that treatment? Whereas potentially we should be asking the question, why are the police acting in this particular way? And it was, of course, really interesting to see, and we'll just have to see what occurs over the weekend, because states like New South Wales have said that the Black Lives Matter protests, are illegal, and they've said that they will take the injunction to the Supreme Court. So we'll just have to see how
illegal
people
from
act.
a coronavirus perspective.
I think it's a broader thing that they're holding illegal protests. So yes, I think coronavirus probably plays a
my
role
understanding
in it.
was that if they go above the 500 mark, they're not going to have a very good time.
Yes, exactly, and this is the sort of thing, because it was really quite interesting watching things unfold in the US, and I'm going to ever so slightly wade and then pull myself back here, but it was interesting. Essentially, the response to a heavy-handed policing action in the US being televised was heavy-handed policing action against people. Essentially they escalated by escalating. Everybody saw what happened, and it was a bunch of police officers either standing on the neck of an individual or essentially not preventing further violence. Or preventing that violence. And the reaction to people was outrage and, shock and marching in the streets. And the reaction to people marching in the streets was an escalation of violence by authorities. So it's just a really, really, really strange thing. And it was, of course, interesting, to juxtapose that with just a couple of weeks ago, those, the COVID-19 lockdown protesters who stood at, various state capitals with firearms, might I add, which frankly is incredibly provocative, and some might even say violent, at least in intent. And the reaction to them was to say, no worries. Have a great time, guys. Do what you should be doing.
I think if I can see where you're going, you'll be interested to see how it plays out this weekend, in the sense that in Australia, obviously we're a lot. I would say we're a bit more subdued as a nation. I think that there is I think that there is an anger there. I would be tremendously surprised if it ended up being an aggressive or violent situation. I can't see that unfolding. It doesn't mean it won't, but I just can't see it unfolding. I think that a majority of Australians are aware that that this is not. That there is a tremendous amount of injustices happening in Australia, and that we need to have that conversation about it, because that conversation is often avoided, and that conversation is a tough one to have. And if I'm a politician, and if I want to try and have some really nice, fluffy, warm conversations with my constituency or my country, talking about that is certainly not one of those conversations. It's a hard conversation to have. It's a difficult conversation to have, but we need to have it, and we need to have those facts discussed, and we need to have those facts analysed. A couple of things that have come to my mind. One, with the police officer who pulled the legs out from the 16-year-old boy, absolutely horrific, no doubt about it. However, I feel like it doesn't really matter what I think about it, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether I think that the boy was doing something wrong and that he deserved it by threatening the police officer, or it doesn't really matter if the police officer did something wrong. At the moment, it doesn't matter, because we don't actually know. And that's why we have an investigation, right? That's why he has to be innocent until proven guilty. Now, he's not innocent, obviously, of doing nothing. Like, he obviously did something, but what that something is, and the circumstances either side of that particular circumstance, is what needs to be investigated. We can't expect to just watch the news. We can't expect to just listen to the radio, get an opinion about it, and go, right, that's it. I think as a nation, we need to make sure that we uphold those beautiful 4 words, innocent until proven guilty, and stay true to that. We can't go around sort of treating these people as though they are guilty, because there's a chance, right, that they do this investigation, that they find out that he is not guilty of what people think he's guilty of, and that just makes us all very angry. Now, I don't know. On the one hand, yeah, it's difficult because you want to try and trust the process, but on the other hand, it's also the police investigating the police, which arcs people up as well. So that's not,
and that I feel is the major issue. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I kind of need to check my own privilege, and hate to be the lefty doing that. And I'm not particularly the lefty in most situations, but all of my interactions with police, since my first to my most recent, have been incredibly pleasant. I've never had a negative interaction with police in my life. And I hate to think that that's just because, every time I go to an airport, whether it's domestic or international, they do the bomb swab. And I think that has a little bit to do with my lustrous beard.
Yeah.
But again, every single one of my interactions with police ever has been, incredibly positive. They've been entirely professional, and things have progressed the way that they needed to progress because of what was occurring in a circumstance. But I feel as though that there is an acknowledged amount of institutionalized racism and institutionalized prejudice that occurs in every major law enforcement institution. I think there are plenty of great people on the front line, and I think there is probably also, it seems apparent, plenty of people on the front line who are not great. And I think that what we also have is a well-documented history of police officers perpetrating something ridiculously negative, and it's sometimes violent, and in some cases causing death of people of a different race to that police officer, and of exactly as you said, a police officer or the police system, the law enforcement system, investigating that case and finding that case to be, not contravening any laws, not breaking any laws.
Yeah, well, out of those deaths that you mentioned before, I don't think any charges have been laid. Am I wrong about that?
I think there have been the occasional, but in the vast majority, it has been deemed justifiable.
Yeah. Okay. And now, this having said that, this also comes off the back of the Dondale detainees being entitled to compensation after being tear gassed. The High Court ruled this week as well. So this is another example of I think the nuanced part there in this particular case is that they followed a process to deal with these particular kids, but the process that they followed shouldn't have been followed at that particular time. I think if I've got it half right. It's not that they. I mean,
the thing is, Greg, and I know you probably got some experience with kids checking their own homework, but when you ask kids to check their own homework, they will more often than not, I feel, at least intuitively, that they will mark themselves more favorably than they would if someone were objectively reviewing them. And this is the equivalent when you have the law enforcement system investigating cases of the law enforcement system enacting justice in the way that they have done in the past, and we've looked at a few of those statistics today. Then it is really a case of them checking their own homework. And essentially, they have, in many cases, checked themselves more favorably than if there were an external objective source.
That's a really, really good point. It sort of leads me on to a comment here by Fred Stokes. He says that I think the biggest issue is how often these investigations have happened in the past without video evidence that goes viral. Would have been a cop versus kid. I think that's what makes people to be outraged, because they want to trust the police in Australia. I think that's a really good point, that they want to, people want to be able to go, right, the law enforcement is here to protect me. The law enforcement is here to do the right thing. I think that particularly in I guess. I don't know. The anomaly is that it seems to me that the police. The anomaly are the police who go out and really try and make an effort. There was a beautiful story on the Drum this week about a couple of police officers who make an effort to go out into the community and learn the language of the community and to be part of the community and to figure out the parts where they need, assistance, like bringing kids home after their sports and all that sort of stuff. And they do all those sorts of things. They're a real connection to the community, so the people know that they can go and trust them if something goes wrong. They've taken that time to do that. Now, whether or not that's what people are protesting, I don't know. Like, if you're going out and protesting, I'm asking, I suppose. I'm not. This is not a judgment question or a rhetorical question. I'm really asking, like, what are you protesting? The idea that there's you can't just protest against racism. I guess you're not going to make anyone a not racist by going. If someone's a racist and they see you protesting,
no, if anything,
that's
you
a good
probably
idea.
further entrench it.
Yeah, so I think that the idea would be that they're protesting about a cultural shift, that there needs to be some active cultural shifts in not just law enforcement, but in so many areas, like whether it's about cultural awareness training, whether it's about how to deal with those conflicting interactions, how to deal with your own emotional regulation. I think that the mental health part of this, and I'm certainly never going to excuse any police officer who does anything that they, like, if they've done something wrong, they need to be charged. However, I'd be surprised if any of our listeners, or even you or I, Jake, haven't done something that we've slightly regretted based on being in a very stressful situation, whether or not you've raised your voice, or whether or not you've sort of just done something, or I don't know. Like, I'm not talking about
no
particularly violent acts, but
you're absolutely right.
I think that the mental health of the police needs to be understood. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be managed well. Like, you can't have these stressed out cops going out and doing these crazy things. And if they do these crazy things, they absolutely need to be charged. I'm not excusing it. It's more of that cultural side of things, right? Or the culture of police.
A lot of this is more. This is more like the situational stuff, right? It's more like it's almost analogous to being out, sort of in the before times, in the before coronavirus times, being out in a pub, and somebody says something and you react poorly, or they push you while you're standing at the bar waiting to get a drink or whatever, or you accidentally knock them and spill their drink or whatever, they react poorly. It's analogous to that type of situation because it's a situational thing. It's a split-second thing. As Mick Fuller, the police commissioner in New South Wales, was speaking about this particular case of the 16-year-old that had their legs swept and was dropped onto their face. Mick Fuller was talking about, essentially the premise that this guy has a really clean record. This isn't, when I say this guy, I mean the police officer in question. He has a very clean record. This isn't typical of this police officer. It just seems like in the situation he's reacted poorly, and to quote Mick Fuller, he said the officer has had a bad day. Yeah. It's one of those. It's one of those things, you can do all of the training in the world. You can do all of the training in the world on how to react in a certain in various situations. And you can drill it and you can drill it and you can drill it. But when you come to that situation and you react poorly, you are judged upon those, the way that you act. And in this case, he reacted poorly.
Yeah, as it should be, and that's the thing, right? We don't. I mean, it certainly seems that way, right? From the armchair perspective, but that's exactly why we have investigations. That's exactly why we have these things, and it's certainly. The cracks are showing, and it's not a perfect system. So, I can't imagine what it's like to put on a uniform and to leave your family at home and to go and try and protect yourself and other people around you. Yeah, exactly. And you're doing it at different times of the day. You're doing it in shifts. There's politics in the police station that you're dealing with. Whether it's machoism or whether it's keeping up with a quota or whatever it is, I don't know about those stresses, but there would be a significant amount of stresses. I mean, you don't become a public servant without without accepting the fact that you're going to have some sort of stresses, right? Nurses, doctors, us.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've got stresses, right? And how you deal with those in the moment and all that sort of stuff. It's a very, very, it's such a nuanced conversation to have. Now, what the big thing, I suppose, the main point.
Can I just interrupt, Greg? Because I think I'm sorry, you're about to go to a main point. I did want to say though, because you were talking earlier about the way, the reason why people are protesting, and I agree with your summation. I would add to that though, I have had I have heard plenty of interviews with the surviving family of David Dungay, that 26-year-old man who was killed in custody, who did say that part of these protests are not just about the way that Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders are treated while in custody, but also the judicial process for the investigation process. This innocent until proven guilty, which is a cornerstone of our society. But it is incredibly important that we recognise that when a system is not serving everybody equally, then that has to be reviewed. And at this stage, we can point to 402 cases of where an Aboriginal died in custody. And, I'm not casting blame one way or the other. I haven't read any of their individual cases. But, I would say in some cases, there have been harrowing circumstances. Anyone who heard the tape of David Dungay dying, it's not a pretty thing. It's awful. Much the same as George Floyd. And, when you look at those cases and you recognize that no one was charged as a consequence and potentially that the system didn't change as a consequence, then you do need to look at that system and ask the question of whether it should remain.
Yeah, there's a real sort of, it's a bit of a phenomenon lately that when things go wrong, there's no one to blame, right? Like it's such a bizarre situation to be in. I suppose, my mind's wandering off to different things now, like, that no one was to blame for sports rorts. No one was to blame for the robo-deaths. No one's to blame for, a majority of these 432 deaths in custody. It just seems like a bizarre sort of situation, I suppose. How do they not figure out who's at fault and hold them accountable for all these things? Well,
that's the thing, that they do find out who's at fault. But I suppose, there's probably good reason to think that a majority of those 432 cases, there were no officers implicated in the individual's death, for a very good reason, because they simply weren't involved. But in certain cases, there might be some that slip through the cracks, and it's not acceptable. It's the same. It's that same as that argument of, I can't remember the president that said it in the past, U.S. president, but it's, I would prefer that, one person on death row who is innocent die than, and actually I don't remember the rest of that quote, but essentially saying that.
Should we Google it?
Yeah, maybe. But essentially saying that, I would much rather see, all the guilty people punished, even if that means that one innocent person is also punished along. It just means that all the guilty people are taken care of. It's just when you compare it to this analog here, maybe the vast majority were innocent. And nothing happened.
You're talking about the police officers, yeah.
Yeah, but I suppose, is there one case? Is there two cases?
Yeah.
One case is too many.
Yeah, it's very, very, it's a very delicate issue. It's a very a great conversation to be having. It's terrible, really. I don't know. It's maybe we've said all that needs to be said about that tonight, I suppose. I'm very proud that we live in a country where people are, fired up about this enough to get out there and protest. I think it's a really good thing. I think that they've got to do it within that we have to remember that we are in the middle of a global pandemic as well, that the pandemic isn't over, so it needs to be controlled, and there needs to be a really clear distinction that you cannot use the terms rioting and protesting synonymously. You just can't do that. And there's a lot of commentators in the US, and I suppose I'm just talking about trying to divide that line and say, let's not fall into that trap here. You know, that they do use it synonymously. They're saying, oh, but the protesters are angry. Well, they're not protesting anymore. You know, like that really, a lot of them are protesting, but a lot of the people, like, you've got to make that, there's a different conversation to be had about the fact that people are rioting and hurting people. I think something like 7 people have died in the protests over there. So for the sake of George Floyd, 7 people have died, and that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so let's keep it peaceful, and let's keep the conversation going, because I think a vast majority of people come at this from a place of love and come at this from a place of let's try and figure this out. I'm yet to hear one person say that, you know, that any of these deaths have been good. I mean, everyone agrees that they're not good, that this is not a good place to be in, statistically speaking, and it's not a great. We don't want this for our people. We don't want this for any family, for anyone. So let's try and work together to find these solutions. I think that's. I think it's a very important thing to be doing, and to be doing it peacefully.
I agree.
But I can see why people get angry too, because you know.
Well, it is
often blocked off at every, metaphorically blocked off at every corner. You know, a lot of the times. It
is a difficult thing to discuss. It is, as we've said a couple of times in this discussion, it is a nuanced subject, but it starts with acknowledging that invariably Black Lives Matter. They do. You know, that's an inclusive term. It doesn't say only Black Lives Matter, but it is an inclusive statement, but an important one. That Black lives do matter. I would like to say, interestingly enough, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, got his angry dad face on today and did say that he thought that protesters this weekend should find a better way of expressing themselves.
Like what?
Well,
a chalk drawing in their driveway.
He made a very I mean that's probably one way. He made a very eloquent point that the Anzac Day commemorations had to be had to be done in a different way, in a much different way than in previous years.
Oh, right, okay.
And essentially that people put themselves forward in solidarity in those cases with the Anzacs, without or rather while observing the social distancing requirements and imperatives. And maybe there is another way to do that, but certainly organisers have set up these protests, and several states have already approved them. But we hesitate to say it's super important that we maintain social distancing during those protests, because far out, the last thing that you want is to bring that home to your parent or grandparent or loved ones.
Yeah, I think the two things that come into my mind there about the fact that he's asked people to do it in a different way. One, Anzac Day is going to happen again next year, right? And so that's fine.
Yeah.
We'll figure out a different way for this year. That's okay. We're
That's
all
a great
happy
point.
with that. Yeah. And that was an act of solidarity. This is by definition an act of defiance. And I think to find a different way. All right, fine. It's good that he's being honest. At least we know what he thinks, right? He's not saying don't do it. He's just saying, I wish you found a different way. Great, that's what he thinks. But
he did, I would say he did make it very clear that Australians do and should have the right to protest about whatever they feel necessary.
But I think it dismisses the urgency and the passion that people have at the moment. I think that people are like, we are having this discussion and this is in the news and it is topical and we have been fighting for this for so long. Let us show how many people have these thoughts and feelings. And so it's an act of solidarity and an act of defiance at the same time. I've fried my brain. But yeah, it's
I totally understand what you're saying. Yeah,
and so they're going to fire. I would maybe it's a little dismissive, and so that means that they're going to be even more people out there. Really, I think it's sort of a bit probably a little bit dismissive about the urgency and the sense in which and the anger in which people are feeling at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, not at
car
all
alarm.
to draw a comparison between the two types of protests, but Scott Morrison did have similar sentiments about the climate protesters, that the strike for life, I think it was, protesters, the school-age children that were leaving school in order to attend the climate protests.
Yeah.
He did have similar sentiments around, that premise of, you should be in school. Find another way to protest. Find another way to do things. So, look, I think his point is taken that it is we're still in a pandemic, and we do need to think about how we are doing this. But invariably, I do agree with you, Greg. This is an act of defiance in that premise.
Yes.
And it is an act of solidarity. And in fact, most of the protests, the title of the protests in which they lodged their request to hold a legal protest with their state, they did. A lot of their names were something like Black Lives Matter, or protest name Black Lives Matter, protest in solidarity with George Floyd. So that was a lot of their names. So I dare say you are correct.
Well, on that note,
this was long.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to make this its own little episode. I think it'd be good.
I think it's a great idea. Yeah.
Upload that tomorrow. That'd be really good.
Yeah.
Look, I think it is a good discussion. I think. Look, I don't know. I think I'm gonna toot our own horn and say we did well to sort of navigate that, because it's good to go through the motions. I mean, we didn't
even spend much time in America because.
Yeah. Well,
it's just. It breaks my heart. Like it really does. To see anyone. Quite literally abused by the legal system is harrowing. But to see someone killed on public television, on various media streams, to know that the family of that poor man have watched that and been asked questions about it. How did you feel about when X, Y, and Z occurred?
Well,
it breaks my heart.
And that's exactly right. And we've seen a few comments like that in the Facebook chat tonight about the fact that the point is that it is in our face, and how much of this is happening when it's not?
How much is happening when it's not?
How much of the injustices are happening when they're not
when they're not in public view?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. That's exactly right. That's the point, right? The point is we have media attention. Let's use that media attention. Let's use the discussion that's happening at the moment to keep that conversation going. I mean, surely no one's in denial that we need to have a conversation about the fact that 432 people have died in police custody. I mean, we need to have that. But yeah. All right. We'll keep that conversation going. It will be interesting to see what unfolds this weekend. If you are going to a protest, we would absolutely love to hear from you. You can email us at thepouchthepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram, all at The Pouch the Podcast. And we would absolutely love to hear from you. Why you're going, or if you've got some experiences about what happened, we really would. That's thepouchthepodcast@gmail.com. And if you're lucky enough, we may even give you a call and you could end up on a little section on our show. What do you think about that, Jake?
I think that'd be amazing. Yeah, I mean, certainly the live crosses that you did to the climate change protests were absolutely awesome. So it'd be amazing if we could bring some of the comments, some of the conversation that's occurring on the ground at those protests to the listenership. That would be amazing.